This is part 2 of my Korps-Kommandeur version 6 training videos, in this case covering how to read and use the scenario cheat sheets. I've come to realise that possessing a good cheat sheet is critical for playing any set of rules, even one which is so simple it's easy to remember everything you need to remember. The issue is, while it may be possible to remember everything, if you want a quick game with minimal preparation, you simply do not have time to do the remembering before the game. This video covers the equipment data chart cheat sheet which is embedded in the scenario guides, which are available on the Korps-Kommandeur version 6 IO group site. When I first started looking at micro-armour material, my original objective was to create supporting material for existing sets of rules, and the primary supporting type of material I wanted to create was scenario guides, as I saw a major issue with many sets of rules was a lack of this. Some rules have excellent scenario guides, such as Flames of War and Panzerkorps, but most have average to poor scenario guides, which I feel reduces their success. FFT3, an excellent set of rules, I feel lacks adequate self-contained scenarios with everything you need to play the game. Spearhead is a better story, but even there are major gaps. What saves Spearhead are all the gamers who create scenarios and post them on the Spearhead IO group site. My scenario guides are designed for competition games, but are based on a time period and a nationality. So the 1939 to 1940 scenario book contains scenarios for 1939 Poland, 1940 France and 1940 North Africa. Within each scenario, all the major combatants are included and players are expected to play historically feasible games. The reason I force this is play balance. It is impossible to create a totally accurate point system for any micro-armour set of rules simply because of the complexity of the topic, but if you force everyone to basically stay within their historical periods and also the historical opponents, you can generally overcome a lot of the issues concerning point systems. While I absolutely avoid hypothetical conflicts, I do allow some, but only ones which are quite feasible. In this example, I've included force mixes for the Saar offensive. Now, this actually did occur. It's just that what did occur was basically an infantry operation and thus not possibly a very interesting conflict, although you can certainly do this. My material in the scenario include French and German armour, and that was certainly not going to be used in the early stages of the Saar offensive. Nonetheless, I have included all those force mixes if people want to play a 1939 German versus French conflict. While certainly not essential, the entire divisional structure of each force mix is provided in each scenario set. This allows our players to customise their force mix if they desire, and if they don't like the recommended force mixes provided in the scenario. More importantly, the suggested force mix is provided in text form, which you can see here at the top right, and in graphical form, which can be seen in the bottom right. This sheet can be printed on an A3 sheet of paper, which makes each element shown here a 3 cm square, which allows you to place the real element on top of. Getting your force mixes together is surprisingly difficult, and it's easy to make errors. This sheet makes it as easy as possible to get your force mixes together and to keep track of losses, if that is important in your game. As Korps-Kommandeur 6 uses strength points, this is doubly useful because it means you do not need to make the start strength point total of your element, or you don't need to mark them on the playing area. This chart tells you what the strength point total of each element is. Only if you suffer losses do you place strength point markers on your element. While I love Bruce Taylor's Korps-Kommandeur series of rules, with this being a quick play version, I really dislike strength point markers, so anything which makes it easier to keep track of strength points is a good thing. This is possibly not so much an issue for games which don't use strength points. Now we get to the meat of the scenario, which is the actual scenario cheat sheet. In this case, it lists all the vehicles, infantry and artillery that a particular side in a scenario could use. There is a separate cheat sheet for artillery, AA weapons and aircraft, which we'll deal with later. The first field is the short name. It happens to be the name of the element, which is unique. So in this case, TKS/20 basically represented the TKS tankette armed with a 20mm weapon. Next field is main weapon. This is, in this case, is a 20mm L73 cannon. This weapon is fixed to the hull, which means it's not in a turret or on a pivot. If it was in a turret, it would say turret, and the same with pivot. This could have or does have an effect in the way you use the weapon in the rules. Infantry elements show a selection of weapons that the infantry would typically be carrying. As you can see here, this particular element, which happens to be the headquarters company, shows the weapons that would typically be in this formation. In this case, it's rifle, which is R, and anti-tank hand grenade, which is ATHG. The H in bracket indicate that it's treated as a heat weapon, although in 1939 it actually wasn't heat, but that's the way the rules treats it. The last field in this column is the secondary weapon, which in this case is a 7.92mm MG mounted as a coaxial weapon. This means it can only be used if the main weapon is not used. Machine guns with a very limited capability, such as most hull-mounted MGs, are typically not included. These tend to be defensive weapons in nature, while a coaxial machine gun can be used in the same manner as the main weapon, which is why it's coaxial. Weapons can also be pivoted or in a turret. In some cases, it can be used as well as the main weapon. In most cases, it cannot. If we look at an infantry element, the secondary weapons field contains extra weapons that infantry formation would normally carry. In this case, light mortars and anti-tank rifles. Infantry use both primary and secondary weapons together, although weapons such as light mortars are normally depicted as separate elements. The whole light mortar topic is a major area of uncertainty and confusion for me. Should you build it into the element, or should you keep it as a separate element? Historically, it should be merged in with the infantry element, but weapons such as light mortars can be buried in with the rest of the troops and thus lost. So these days I split them off as separate elements, which I also do with MMG. However, saying all of that, I really do not know what the best solution is, for a host of reasons not already covered. As it turns out, I decided for Korps-Kommandeur version 6 that light mortars should be separate elements. So in this case, only the anti-tank rifle is being used by this element. In other sets of rules, where it makes more sense, the light mortars are embedded with the infantry. While obvious, this field shows the nationality, which for this cheat sheet should always be POL, which means Polish. This is purely a descriptive field, but TK means that this element is a tankette. Finally, in this column, we have the strength or the points cost of a single strength point. Next column at the top, we find first the movement allowance of the element, which is shown in centimetres. In this example, the element has a movement allowance of 16 centimetres across the default terrain. The T after the 16 tells us this element is tracked, which means it has good cross-country movement capability. We can see a F further down as well, which means that this element is on foot. A lowercase m means this weapon can be manhandled, but would normally be towed. The word tow means this weapon can only be moved by being towed. Another common value is W, which means it's wheeled, and there's a number of other values such as all-wheel drive, animal, cycle, etc. Most elements can move twice if they do not conduct any fire combat. So it would be possible for this element to cover 32 centimetres in a single game turn. The next field, which is Viz, is really just a general game guide, and it gives us an idea of the visibility range to observe this element. In this case, the basic observation range is 8 centimetres, which means in clear weather and daylight can be seen up to 32 centimetres away. There are a number of observation modifiers, so this is only used to assist a player in selecting the correct row on the observation table. The fires field is only used if the element contains or is equipped with missiles and tells you how many times it can fire a missile in a single game turn. In World War II, really only the Germans could possibly have missile-armed troops, and that would only be in a hypothetical scenario. We now move to the more meaty fields. The first is DEF, which is the defensive effectiveness of the element. In this case, the field is made up of three values. The first is its armour, which in this case is 3. A soft target would show the letter or uppercase letter S. The next value in parentheses represents special armour, which could have an unusual effect against heat. This includes spaced and applique. If the firer uses heat, you would add 1 in this case to the element's defensive effectiveness. Otherwise, this value is not used. The value at the end is the element's aspect modifier. In this case, the element is small, so is hard to hit. Thus, you would add 1 to its defensive effectiveness if subject to fire combat. In close combat, this is not used because it doesn't matter how small it is. When you're right next to it, you simply cannot avoid seeing it. The next field, NTS or notes, provides you with any special info relating to the element. In this case, R means it's radio armed or radio equipped, which does not have an effect in these rules. Other fields indicates it could be amphibious or capable of deep fording. In the modern period, there are lots of different notes that may be found here. The next field shows if the element has any night fighting capabilities, such as infrared, thermal imaging, or image intensification. In World War II, only the Germans possessed any rudimentary night fighting capabilities, so generally this field would be left blank. We now move to the fire combat fields. The next 4 fields in this row are used if the element's primary weapon is using some kind of special ammunition, such as heat, APDS, HVAT, or APCR. The owning player selects this ammunition normally, if allowed, or in some cases a player has to pass a quality test in order to use it. This does not apply with heat, which anyone can use if it's equipped with it. In 1939, the Polish only possesses a type of heat weapon in the form of anti-tank hand grenades, which weren't exactly heat, but are treated as a heat round in these sets of rules. If we go down to the infantry, in this case the value is C3H. This means it can only be used for close combat, has a fire effectiveness of 3, and is classed as heat. If it was used against special armour, it would suffer a disadvantage, that is, a special armour value would be added to the def value of the target. But in 1939 there was very little in the way of spaced and applique armour. If we go to the next row, this represents the values for anti-tank weapons or anti-tank capability. In this case, only the primary weapon possesses anti-tank capabilities. The first field is amalgam of the following 3 fields, so we'll look at each field separately before we go back to this combined value. The first value is the anti-tank close assault effectiveness value, CAE, and this is used when the element is in close combat and facing an armoured opponent. In that case, it has a fire effectiveness of 4. The next field is the anti-tank fire effectiveness of the primary weapon if fired at something at range, which in this case is FE5. As you can see, its fire effectiveness is greater than when used in close combat. The final field in this row is the anti-tank fire range in centimetres. This represents the weapon's effective range in centimetres. It can fire out to twice this range, but that is considered its maximum range, and there are some negative modifiers when this occurs. We will now go to the bottom row. The bottom 4 fields are the element's anti-infantry weapons values. If we start with the CAE value, this shows there are 2 weapons here. The first, which is C3, is the primary weapon, which happens to be a 47mm L40 gun firing HE. The second is its secondary weapon, which happens to be a coaxial 7.55mm machine gun, which is C2. As the secondary weapon is coaxial, it can only be used if the primary weapon is not used, and as the primary weapon has a better value, it would never be used as a result. If we move over to the FV column, this shows both weapons' anti-infantry fire effectiveness at range. The first value of 4 is for the primary weapon, and the second value of 3 is for the machine gun. Again, the machine gun would not be used in this case. The last field in this row shows both weapons' anti-infantry fire range. The first value of 6 centimeters is for the primary weapon, and the second value of 6 centimeters is for the secondary weapon. In this case, the secondary weapon is redundant, or the value for it is redundant, as you would never use it. However, there are many cases when the secondary weapon is better than the primary weapon when used against infantry, particularly if the primary weapon does not have HE rounds. We'll now go back to the combined field, and this shows the combined value of this element's anti-infantry fire factors. The 4H is the primary weapon's fire effectiveness, which in this case it is telling you it is using HE rounds. The rest of the values match the values we've already covered already. While it's nice to have a single string describing everything you need to know about a weapon, I found complex situations or complex strings like this are difficult to read easily, at least for me, so I find the single values also quite useful. But the combined value does contain some unique information, such as whether or not it's firing HE shells, which may or may not be particularly important for various rules. Incidentally, all these values that you see here are actually calculated in a spreadsheet from actual values for weapons, which is why we see weapon values that we probably would not use in, let's say, these sets of rules, but other sets of rules, which I use these values for, you would potentially use it. If we go down to the infantry elements can always use all their weapons. So if we go to the CAE value here, we get a value of C4 and C3, which are normally added together for close combat. Thus, this infantry element really effectively gets C7. If we move over to the FE value, once again, because both weapons have the same range, we would be adding these two values together. So the 4 and 3 would be added together to give you a value of 7 FE. Now, if the ranges were different, you may be required to spin separately for each weapon. We'll now be moving to the indirect fire values. Incidentally, there's a separate chart which contains all the indirect fire values which players may use to quickly find their artillery. However, all the indirect fire values are contained in the main cheat sheet regardless. These three fields provide information about the element's indirect capability in a similar manner to the way it described an element's direct fire capability. In this case, the weapon is a light mortar. While my infantry elements show a L mortar or light mortar in the secondary weapons fields, for these rules I've split these weapons out into separate elements. In other rules I combine them, which is why the secondary weapon still shows this weapon as being in the element. Indirect fire effectiveness is the weapon's fire effectiveness. In this case it is 5, and the indirect fire range, which is its range, which is 4 centimeters at effective range and 8 centimeters at maximum range. The first field is its combined value. So you can see 5/4 basically means the FE is 5, the FR or fire range is 4. The combined value also provides other useful information not found in the other fields, such as the minimum range and visible fire effectiveness. In this case, the weapon can fire at a target it can see using a fire effectiveness of 7. When used as a normal indirect fire weapon, its fire effectiveness is 6, and its range is 47 centimeters effective and 96 centimeters maximum. This row here represents a indirect fire weapon's RAP or rocket assist projectile values. In World War II, only the Germans possessed wrap rounds, although this is much more common in the Cold War period. The ammo field contains information about the ammunition that can be fired by this indirect fire weapon. In this case, the weapon can fire smoke. Other ammunition which can be fired is illumination. In the modern period, this can also include chemical, nuclear, and a range of modern ordnance which we'll not deal with in 1939 Poland versus Germany situation. This field shows the visible fire effectiveness range, which in this case is 8. This is basically the element which can see the target and decides to directly fire at it, using its own visibility, I suppose. The other field that would be of great interest to rockets and other mortars, for example, is a weapon's minimum fire range. Basically, a weapon cannot fire at any target up to this range in centimetres. In this case, the Polish possess no indirect fire weapons which have a minimum fire range. On the reversed side of the scenario cheat sheets, there is also additional information or separate charts for anti-aircraft, indirect fire weapons, and also aircraft. In this case, we see anti-aircraft weapons in a separate table, with this row containing the anti-aircraft gun values and the row below the anti-aircraft missile values. Only the Germans have any missiles in World War II, which probably were never used, so this row is mainly used for Cold War conflicts. The field being pointed to is the AA gun's fire effectiveness value, which happens to be a 4. If this is the AA weapon's fire range, remember this is fire range against aircraft, which in this case is 24 centimetres effective and 48 centimetres maximum. If the weapon is radar assisted, that information is provided here. However, only the US possess such weapons in World War II. The notes field lists any specific notes about the weapon, and the fires field is used for missiles only and just basically tells you the maximum number of missiles you can fire in a single game turn. The other unique table is for aircraft, and they use their own table. In this case, the aircraft forward MG cannon weapons are listed in the main weapon field. In this case, it represents two 7.92mm machine guns. The secondary weapon field contains all information concerning bombs and rockets, which in this case is 100 kilograms of bombs. This lists the aircraft defensive effectiveness, both against guns and missiles. In both cases, it's 3. In Korps-Kommandeur version 6, this is only used when subject to anti-aircraft fire. This lists the aircraft ECM capabilities against radar-assisted guns or radar-assisted missiles. In World War II, this is not used. This lists the aircraft air-to-air missiles, both short and long-range missiles. Apart from the Germans, no one uses these fields in World War II, and even for the Germans it would only be possibly a hypothetical, their Ju-88s firing their little wire-guided air-to-air missiles. This field is the aircraft's air-to-ground fire effectiveness, which represents its guns. This is used when the aircraft is attacking a ground element. This field represents the aircraft's air-to-air fire effectiveness, which again represents its forward-facing guns. These rules do not have air-to-air combat, so for some reason the fighter above, that is the PZL P11C, does not have an air-to-air value, something I will need to solve. However, as I never used it in the rules, I've never noticed it. The Ord B is the aircraft's bomb load or bomb-based fire effectiveness value. Once again, this is used when the aircraft is attacking a ground element. The Ord R represents the aircraft rocket ordnance or rocket fire effectiveness. Once again, this is used by the aircraft when attacking ground elements. The Ord SO value represents the aircraft standoff air-to-ground capability. Only the Germans possessed a rudimentary weapon in this class in World War II, but it is commonly used in the modern period. The SRT-MN, or minimum sortie rate, is the aircraft's minimum sortie rate, which is used when the aircraft is used in a cab rank arrangement. This is reasonably rare unless you have an awful lot of aircraft. The SRT-MX, or maximum sortie rate, is the aircraft's maximum sortie rate, which is what is commonly used. Once an aircraft is successfully used, it can only be used again after it waits out a number of game turns equal to its sortie rate. This completes my guide on how to use the Korps-Kommandeur version 6 scenario cheat sheets. Denken Sie daran, immer für Hilfe heimatlichen zu kämpfen.